was preparing, it never occurred to me to how many writers that North Carolina has fostered over the, many that are born here and those that have moved here. So we do have quite a rich heritage in writing. So, and I thought it would be a really great idea to do some programs so that people could meet some of these authors. And before we get started, I'll just mention that our next one will be on February the 4th with Esme Addison, who is a first-time published mystery writer. She's written this cute little, actually it's the beginning of a series, a little cozy mystery series. And so that'll be on February 4th at 7 p.m. So if you would like to join us for that, please just contact me and I'll send you the link when it's available. And of course, there are also lots of other great programs at the library. If you just go to the library's website and click on the calendar, you will see a lot of great offerings. We've got some really good things coming up for Black History, what is now called African American Black History Month. I've got a Black musical family trivia game, which there will be prizes for the contestants. And I've also have 3 authors coming here because the theme is about the family and diversity. Black History Month this year. And so I've got 3 authors who have written some interesting books on family. And I have to say that, this, as everywhere else, this pandemic has been challenging for us to provide these kind of programs and things, but I think we have risen to the occasion and we do appreciate your support. This is your library, as Beth as we've talked about in the past, that this is our library and we really want to, provide the things you would like to participate in. So please always feel free if you have ideas or something that you feel like you would like us, to present. We are very open to suggestions. Let's see. Well, we've got about 1 more minute, it looks like. Of course, I discovered tonight that my laptop time is 2 minutes difference from my phone time. And those of you all who I sent the message out today about if you needed to call me in case you had any problems, well, the phone rang a few moments ago and I thought that it was maybe I almost didn't answer it because I didn't recognize the number, but I said, well, no, it may be one of the participants. I picked up the phone, this guy said, this is so-and-so from Spectrum News. I said, from Spectrum K. I said, okay, no, we can't talk, we can't talk now. So I was glad so I'm assuming that nobody's had a problem logging in. Okay, well, it's 7:05 right now, so we'll get started. I'd like to welcome Lee Zacharias for joining us in our North Carolina author chats. I have just got to share with you this interesting information about her. She has received all of these awards over time. She's received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the North Carolina Arts Council. She is a 2-time recipient of North Carolina's Sir Walter Raleigh Award and has won Southern Humanities Review's Theodore Christian Hoepfner Award, Prairie Schooners Glenn, if I pronounced it correctly, Duchessa Award, and 2 silver medals from the Independent Publisher Book Award. And at random, one of her novels was a finalist in literary fiction for the 2013 International Book Awards, the National Indie Lit Awards, and the USA Best Book Awards. Across the Great Lake, which is the book that we'll be featuring tonight, has been named a 2019 Michigan Notable Book and was a finalist in literary fiction for the 2018 Forward Indies Book of the Year. Now, her fiction and nonfiction have appeared in numerous journals, including, among others, the Southern Review, Shenandoah, 5 Points, Gettysburg Review, Crab Orchard Review, Outdoor Photographer, and Our State. And speaking of photography, you must go to her website and look at those wonderful photographs that she has taken. And 10 times her essays have been named Notable Essays of the Year by the Best American Essays, and which also was also reprinted her essay Buzzers in the Best American Essays for 2008. For decades, she served as editor of the Greensboro Review. She holds degrees from Indiana University, Hollins College, and the University of Arkansas, and has taught at Princeton University and UNCG, where she is the Emerita Professor of English, as well as many conferences, most recently the Wildacres Writers Workshop, the University of North Carolina of Arts and Sciences, the University of North Carolina Board of Governors, and the Southeast Modern Language Association have all recognized her with awards for teaching excellence. I really wanted to share that with you because after reading the book, I felt like she deserved every last one of these honors. I thoroughly enjoyed the book, and I'm looking forward to the others that I have picked up in the past week of reading those. So, Lee, I'll let you get started and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you so much, Ronald. That was just really an overwhelming introduction. I'm not sure I can live up to it. I'm going to read just to start. I would say it's an icebreaker, but that would be a really bad pun. So I'm just going to read the first page and a couple lines from my last novel, Across the Great Lake, and talk a little bit about how I came to write it. And Ron will have questions for me, and y'all will ultimately have questions. So we'll just begin there. We went to the ice. That was the year my mother died, but I do not remember her. What I remember is the ice. Everywhere I looked, a world made of ice, and then the fire. But first, there were the voices. Get up, he said. I can't, she said. You mean you won't? I can't. Was I listening outside the closed door? Surely my mother taught me better, had told me that eavesdropping was not something a polite little girl would do. Was I already a bad girl? Perhaps she despaired of me. I don't know. We got stuck in the ice. There was a storm, and while we were gone, my mother died. My father was not a man of words, and now that so many years have passed, there is no one left to ask whether I was ever a good girl, a girl who might have deserved love or not. There's other women lost a child. You don't know. I know enough. A cloud of silence seemed to thicken, though perhaps they only lowered their voices. Perhaps I simply couldn't hear them. For the last time, get up, he said. You've another child needs tending. Did she answer? My father was a captain. When he spoke, people listened. They did what he said. Perhaps she repeated, I can't. The only memory I really have of her, those two words in her voice. Or perhaps when my father offered me as a reason for her to get back up and live, she said nothing at all. I had just turned 5 years old. In the hallway, there was a yellow light in a sconce. It was a grand house set against the hill on Leelanau Avenue, but the light had scorched a spot on the wallpaper, and there was a water stain near a seam, a small brownish lake in the green and gray print. I used to spend hours perusing those blotches, as if imperfection was what my eyes sought from the start. All right, then, my father said, I'm taking the girl. So that's how it begins. The year is 1936. I chose that year because I knew I wanted to have this ship travel across the lake. It's a railroad car ferry. It carried entire trains across the lake. They began running across Lake Michigan in 1892, and they stopped running in 1982. So for 90 years, these enormous coal-powered steamships carried entire railroad trains across Lake Michigan. And I needed a reason for this little girl to be on the boat. So that's how her mother comes to die. Her her father takes her because he doesn't know what else to do with her. And I knew that I wanted the journey to be more perilous than it would be now, even if the ships were still running. So I knew I wanted it to be before radar. And when I started reading, I discovered that 1936 was one of the coldest winters in Michigan on record. It was one of the winters when the lake froze shore to shore, which it does sometimes, but not always. And so that's how I settled on 1936, which of course puts me in the Depression. But this particular town, which I have to say I never lived in, I've never lived in Michigan. I came to want to have lived in Michigan as I was writing this book, but I never did. I grew up at the southern end of Lake Michigan in the, I was born in Chicago, but I grew up in the really ugly industrial belt that is, of course, now the Rust Belt. So we had a beach on Lake Michigan. It was about 10 miles from my house, but it was polluted. And if you look to the east, you look to the west, all you saw were smokestacks belching smoke. And when I was about maybe 11, 12 years old, we went on a vacation and stayed in Frankfort, Michigan, which is also on the lake in Northwest Michigan on the Lower Peninsula. And I thought it was the most beautiful place I'd ever seen. You look to the right, you look to the left. What you saw were these wooded bluffs, these pristine beaches. There were kids playing volleyball on the beach. I thought I would be one of them if only I lived there. Never mind that I have absolutely no hand-eye coordination and was always the last person chosen for any team in gym. And pretty soon it morphed. If I lived in this town, I would be able to walk wherever I wanted. It was a small town. I wouldn't have to ask my father for a ride. So I would have complete freedom. And then, it spirals. If I lived there, I would be prettier than I was. I would be more popular than I was. The boy I liked would like me back. And somehow this town just stuck in my mind. We never went back. And I just imagined that if I had only grown up there instead of somewhere else, I would have had a perfect life. But of course, by the time I began to write this book, I had long since learned that a novel is no place for a perfect life. So that's not exactly what Fern, the narrator, gets. But it was my attraction to place that really led me to write this book. My husband was born in Tidewater, Virginia, but he has family in Michigan. And I was on my way to Traverse City to meet him for a little family reunion. He had been in Pennsylvania going to a student wedding. And so we were just going to meet in Traverse City. And I realized that this town that had made such an impression on me as a girl was 10 minutes out of my way. So I took that little detour and it just absolutely blew my mind. It was exactly the way I remembered it. And when in the world does that ever happen? I mean, more than 40 years had passed. So I promised myself that I would go back. I wanted to write an essay about what the town had meant to me and my imagination as a girl, because when I was 11 or 12, I started writing a novel in my head about this town. It was not across the Great Lake. It was a silly teenage romance fantasy kind of thing that I never put to pen and paper. And probably that's why it stayed in my head longer than any of the other juvenilia that I actually wrote down in my little steno books that were what we used for class notes in those days. And so I did go back, and then I realized that there was one thing different, and that was that the railroad car ferries were no longer running. And the foghorn had been such a vivid part of my memory of this town. It's such an evocative sound that I started asking people, the servers at the restaurant, the clerk at the BP station, anybody I saw on the street, when did the ferry stop running? And it was like anything local. People would go, 5, 6, was it 2 years? Were there ever ferries? Um, so I bought a history of the railroad car ferries called 90 Years Crossing Lake Michigan by Grant Brown Jr. And I started reading it, and I was just immediately plunged into this world of the tricky currents, the dangerous shoals, the fierce winds, storms, and all this ice, because unlike all other kinds of boats that use the Great Lakes, the ore boats, the freighters, these ships ran year round. They didn't lay off for the winter. Even when the lake froze shore to shore, they ran. They'd get stuck in the ice, and then another one would be sent out to free that one, and then that one would get stuck, and a third one would be sent out. So sometimes these trips that were supposed to be maybe 18 hours round trip would end up being a month, because they'd be stuck out there in the middle of the lake on the ice. And I was just fascinated by that. As soon as I finished reading that book, I looked for another history and found one. And pretty soon I was reading everything I could get my hands on about the area, about navigation on the lakes, the formation of the national park that's just north of Frankfurt, Sleeping Bear National Dune Lakeshore. And I'd finished my essay, and I just couldn't let the material go. So I thought, there's got to be a novel in this. And I wrote that first line, "We went to the ice," and I had absolutely no idea who was speaking, who said that. Over the course of the first chapter, I figured out that it was a 5-year-old girl whose father was the captain. I knew it had to be someone who was not part of the crew, because the crew is so familiar with the ship that it's not that interesting to them. And I wanted the narrator to be someone who is just wide-eyed, and everything that she sees or experiences is brand new to her, which is how I landed on the 5-year-old girl. She was young enough that I believed that she would not have a memory of her mother. My own mother's mother died when she was 7, and she had no memory of her mother, and that was really the greatest sorrow of her life. So I think that's a little bit of an introduction to how I came to write it. I also knew that there would be a ghost from the beginning, because in the course of my reading, I discovered that there is absolutely no such thing as a lighthouse or a ship anywhere that does not have a ghost. So I knew there would be a ghost, although I was probably 20 or so drafts into the novel before I realized who the ghost was and what the ghost wanted. And that changed everything for me, even though in the actual writing of the novel, it changed one line. But it made all the difference, knowing who the ghost was and what the ghost wanted. So I think I'll leave it there. Ronald, I know you have questions.
First I want to start out with how I was totally fascinated by the Great Lakes and their descriptions. I had never really given them much thought over the years. And also the book really made me realize that these were enormous, because I had never thought about ships actually traveling the lakes and the ice. You described so many things in that book so beautifully that I could imagine them. I could visually almost imagine them, that the ice and them having to break the ice, freeing of the books and everything. It was just totally fascinating. And also, one thing I must point out is that what one of the teachers said about remembering the Great Lakes using the word homes. I thought that was a fantastic touch. Fern was an absolutely delightful character. I'm not quite sure how hard it is to write things from a child's viewpoint, but you did a wonderful job. I felt like, so this is a child. There was really nothing I would say except for some of her, but there was something really adult about her, that she was a well drawn out. Well, all the characters are well drawn out, and of course you explained why you decided to go with her being a 5-year-old. But I'm curious as to how her life went. And well, I'll also say it was really great to see a little North Carolina connection. I always enjoy that in a book when I read it, because after she got older and got married and wound up in North Carolina.
Yeah. Yes, and unfortunately, she doesn't think so much of North Carolina.
Oh, that's true.
And all of my life here, and am happy to be in North Carolina, but for her, nothing ever quite measures up to her lost place. And in a way, we mourned it together as I was writing. She mourned it because it was hers and she lost it. I mourned it because I wanted it when I was a girl and it was never mine. I don't think you're not realizing the size or the danger of the Great Lakes is at all unusual. One thing I learned in reading about the Great Lakes is that in New York, particularly New York publishing, for a long time there was a tremendous prejudice against the Great Lakes. There was just this belief nobody would be interested in anything that had anything to do with the Great Lakes. And so there were writers who would get these rejection letters that would say, now, if this were set on the ocean, somebody might be interested, but who cares about a lake? But if you've ever been to the Great Lakes, Huron, Michigan, Superior, they're huge. Even from the middle, you can't see either side.
Well, also, when you mentioned that beaches, I never think of putting the word beach with a lake. And now you've gotten, and now I really actually want to go there and see them myself. It just sounds so fascinating.
They are absolutely gorgeous, but they are not easy to walk on. Because they're not tidal. The lakes don't have tides. So you don't have that little area of hard packed sand that you have on Atlantic beaches, say, where at low tide you have this wide area where it's very easy to walk. You're walking in loose sand. It's like walking at the top of the beach all the way down to the water. And also a lot, particularly on the northwest Michigan coast of Lake Michigan, there are a lot of rocks. It's not a rocky shore in the sense of cliffs, but there are a lot of small stones, and it's not comfortable to walk barefoot along the beach. But it's absolutely gorgeous.
Well, it was very easy to imagine all of these characters. I really did enjoy the Fern's interaction with the crew. And, in some of those sequences, I felt like I was in the middle of them, like when they were going through the storms and things like that. So I'm thinking that I will say I felt like that you enjoyed writing this book.
I had a wonderful time writing this book. It gave me an excuse to keep going up to Michigan, for one thing, which I really enjoyed. And people up there were so incredibly helpful to me. I talked to the mayors of Frankfort and Alberta. I talked to a woman who had gone to the Alberta grade school, which was torn down years and years and years ago. I talked to a man whose father had been the pastor at the Lutheran Church back when it was called first the Norwegian Lutheran Church, then the Scandinavian Lutheran Church. And he still had his grandfather's sermons that were written in Norwegian because they used to conduct services in Norwegian. And he offered to loan me these sermons. and you know, which was incredible. I didn't take him up on the offer because I don't know what I would have done with them, but it was just amazing how wonderfully helpful people were. And I had a lot of fun writing the crew, although I have to say that at first I was terrified. Once I realized I had this 5-year-old girl on this ship, and the only reason she could be there is that her father is the captain. Because these were not ticketed as passenger boats. There were passenger quarters. Occasionally in the summer, a family might book cabins on this to take a shortcut across the lake. But primarily the passenger quarters were used for railroad officials while they were going across the lake. So there wouldn't be other passengers on the ship. And I suddenly realized I'd put this little girl on a ship with 28 sailors, and I have never been around a bunch of sailors in my whole life, and I haven't the faintest idea how they talk. And I had a former student at Wildacres, a place that Sherry and I have in common, who is from Wisconsin. And she said, oh, just have them tell Ole and Lena jokes. I'd never heard an Ole and Lena joke in my life. Down at the southern end of Lake Michigan, I grew up in neighborhoods that were largely Eastern European. So I knew a lot of Polish jokes, but I didn't know any Ole and Lena jokes. And as soon as I looked up one of these jokes online, which might as well have been a Polish joke because all ethnic jokes follow basically the same pattern. The only thing that's funny about the Ole and Lena jokes is that when a Swede tells them Ole and Lena, the butts of the joke, are Norwegian, and when a Norwegian tells them Ole and Lena are Swedes. And that struck me funny. But as soon as I put this joke that I'd had to look up online in the mouth of one of these sailors, all of their voices came to me. And it was like I had spent my whole life sitting around the mess, listening to them talk. It was amazing. The part of the book that scared me the most when I started out writing it became a lot of fun to write, and really in some ways easy, because dialogue is easier than narrative.
Well, I'll say is that, you know, I've never been around sailors either, but just everything in the book just felt so real. And one of my favorite passages is when Fern announces at her birthday party that she wants to be a captain, and the reaction of the women who are there about that, because, you know, that's something they never even considered that a woman would be able to do.
Well, and it was something that a woman would not have been able to do or been able to aspire to in 1936. Women did not serve on the ships except as cabin maids, and the railroad ferries generally did not have cabin maids. The cooks were men. The whole crew were men. So when she has that experience at the birthday party, what upsets her so much is not just that these women kind of pat her on the head and go, oh, isn't that cute? Isn't that funny? Little girl wants to grow up to be a captain. Well, maybe she can be a secretary.
Right.
She realizes it's true at that point that she's been deceiving herself. And that's what sends her to her room in tears and ruins her birthday party, her realization that they're absolutely right, that she can't grow up to be a captain.
I also found the relationship between her and the stepmother very interesting too, especially when she was saying, like, you know, she didn't hate her, but she really didn't like her either.
No, I wanted the stepmother not to be the cliched evil stepmother. I just wanted her to be someone that Fern does not bond with, She's someone who has not had children herself. She's middle-aged when she marries Fern's father, and she just hasn't been around children. She doesn't really know how to interact with children, and they don't really bond. And though Fern is very young and she wouldn't know how to put it in words, she's grieving as a child. And her stepmother, one thing she holds against her stepmother is that her stepmother is so relentlessly cheerful.
Yes, she is.
And, for someone who's got depression or someone who's grieving, that's not necessarily the best person for you to be around. So I wanted to portray a relationship as one that just didn't gel, but not to make her stepmother a bad person. And she honestly thinks that she's doing the right thing when she sends Fern away to boarding school. Fern is devastated. She doesn't want to leave the lake. She feels like everything that she loves is being taken away from her. But the stepmother thinks, I don't know what to do with this girl. And this is this wonderful educational opportunity. This is like the best boarding school in the country for girls. So of course, and she wants to sell the house and move back home to Beulah. So she has her reasons for sending Fern off, and they aren't entirely bad reasons. They aren't entirely that she wants to get rid of the girl.
Well, that's true. But I think also by that time, the reader is so invested in Fern, and we know how she feels about where she's living, that when I said, oh no, the stepmother wants to uproot her and send her away from here, don't do that. But I realized, she had to make some choices after the other things that happened, which I will not reveal, because I want everybody who has not read the book to please read it. And
thank you.
Oh well, it's just such a wonderful book. I'm going to tell you something that I never thought anybody would inspire me to do, but thanks to your quote at the beginning from Moby Dick, I'm decided, okay, I'm going to give Moby Dick a try. I have avoided reading Moby Dick forever because I was always afraid that it might be like my experience trying to get through War and Peace, but that's a whole other story.
So how did we get going?
Yeah, that was an idea that just didn't go very well. One of the things that I noticed about some of the reviewers said, and I felt like that they were totally true about this, is because the book grabbed me from the beginning. And like one reviewer said, and it won't let go. And I noticed that was a common comment about a lot of your other books. Because you've written a variety of things. You were in that anthology of Runaway, which I definitely was on my list to read. And of course, you had the collection of nonfiction essays. Did you find it difficult to go back and forth between those genres?
No, what happened is that I was writing fiction. I started out as a fiction writer. My first book was a book of short stories, and I wrote a novel. That was my second book. And then I took too long to write my second novel, which would have been my third book. I was teaching full-time. I was editing a literary journal. I was directing the writing program at UNCG, and I had a baby. And so
wow.
Things sort of conspired to make it take longer than it should have to write my what would have been my second novel, which is actually coming out finally in June. So for anybody who thinks that, at a certain point you should just give up, I will say that the book that I have coming out in June was 9 years in the writing and something like 32 years in the marketing.
Wow.
But what happened was that the novel that's coming out in June is called What a Wonderful World This Could Be, a kind of takeoff, a little bit of a liberty, taking a little bit of liberty with Sam Cooke's song. And it was not titled that back then, but it's about a woman who ends up marrying a civil rights and anti-war activist in the 1960s. And I finished the book and sent it off to my agent in 1990. And it was right after this enormous media blitz of 60s stuff, it was 20 years ago today, attention that the 60s got in 1988 and 1989. And trying to sell that book was like trying to sell last year's pet rock.
Oh, wow.
I had a contract with Houghton Mifflin, but my editor left. My editor had loved the book, but my editor left, and I was inherited by someone who didn't like realistic fiction at all. He only liked experimental fiction, so he wasn't interested in my stuff. And it was a period of great upheaval in publishing, which is still going on today. And so the next house that had it wanted it, but the editor and the editor-in-chief both got fired before we could sign a contract. And it went a couple more houses. One person wanted it but couldn't get house support, and so on. And after it had been rejected about 4 or 5 times, my agent said, well, just throw it away and write another. And for someone who had just spent 9 years writing this book, that didn't seem like very easy advice to follow. And I took some time off. My second novel, the woman who marries the civil rights activist, is a photographer. And photography was something I knew something about. My first novel was about a clarinetist, and I knew nothing about music. And so immersed myself in the world of musicians and music while I was writing that book. The Eastern Music Festival meets, until this past year of COVID, meets at Guilford College in Greensboro every year. So I would hang out with the musicians at the Eastern Music Festival. I would go to every rehearsal, have lunch with them every day, ask them crazy questions like, when you play the violin, does your neck hurt? And they'd go, look at that. Look at that knot on my neck. And I finished the book and just went, oh, I can't play a single note. This is not my world. I have to leave it behind. And in a way, every book you write, unless you're an autobiographical writer, is something like creating a country for yourself that you will one day have to leave with the homesick backward glance of an exile. And I feel that way very much about Across the Great Lake. For while I was writing that book, Frankfurt was finally mine. And now it's not mine anymore. It belongs to the reader. But I did write another novel, which also took a long time to publish. They both sat on the shelves for years. I didn't send them out. They just, gathered dust. And then finally in 2013, the one called At Random came out. Well, after I wrote At Random and was having trouble publishing that, following on the heels of not having been able to publish the novel right before it, the one that's coming out this June, I just didn't want to write another novel. It felt like throwing good money after bad. And during the process of writing the novel that will be coming out in June, I was asked to write an essay for a special issue of the now defunct literary journal Antaeus. And when you write a novel, as I say, you create a world, but then you got to live in that world for as long as it takes to write that novel. And it was so liberating to write this essay in the middle of working on this novel, because for 9 years I spent my life in my head in the 1960s and very early 70s. And all of a sudden, writing this personal essay, I could just sort of reach over to this shelf of my experience and say, oh, I think I'll take that off, and over to that shelf. I think I'll use that, and put all these things together. And what kind of sense do they make when I put them together? And so after I didn't sell that second book that I didn't sell, it was my third novel, right away, I just turned to writing essays, and that's what I wrote for 10 years. And as I said before, when I started to research across the Great Lake, I had no intention of writing a novel. I intended to write an essay. I did write an essay, and the essay was published, but I couldn't let the material go. And what I will say is that the 10 years that I spent writing personal nonfiction, essays that are like short memoirs, really changed the way I approached fiction. Across the Great Lake became a much more introspective book in some ways than my earlier books had been, much less driven by dialogue. You have the scenic chapters that take place on the boat, where the crew is talking, or Fern is talking to Alv, the deckhand who befriends her. But you also have a lot of chapters that are written from the point of view of the 85-year-old woman she becomes, the woman who says she lived the rest of her life, her adult life, at half-mast as a result of what happens on this journey in 1936. And it's interesting that you say that the book grabs you from the beginning, because when I first started to send it out, that was a problem that a lot of agents and editors had with it. It's written in the form of a memoir. If I had to describe it in terms of genre, I would call it a fictional memoir. It's not at all autobiographical, but it is written in the form of a memoir, which means that it's backloaded instead of front-loaded. A novel, a lot of novels are what happens next kind of books. You get some tension going on the first page, and the reader's got to keep turning the page to find out what's this leading to? What's this leading to? What's going to happen? What's going to happen? And this is more the kind of book where I drop in these little chapters that promise something's going to happen. Hey, there's a ghost coming. I'm not going to bring the ghost on stage right yet, but stick with me. There's a ghost. And then when you get to the end, once I figured out who the ghost was, the end changes your understanding of everything that came before. So it was not hard to go back to fiction, but I went back to fiction very much influenced by the many years that I spent writing personal nonfiction. And the book that I'm writing now is a memoir about my mother's life. So I'm back with my next book that's coming out, the one in June, is a novel, but the book that I'm working on now is nonfiction. It's a memoir about my mother.
Well, that's one of the things I do. I love reading memoirs and biographies. And I didn't really look at it from the aspect that this book was actually a fictional memoir, but you're right. Because, as we're listening to Fern, that when she is 85 and she's looking back and she's relaying her observations on things, like the time she spent with her husband and her current relationship with her children, even though the daughter was not featured prominently, but I felt like one time to say, I want to talk to the daughter and say, treat your mother better than what you're doing. Because I just sort of felt like she was just sort of tolerating her mother. And like I think one thing said, you could almost see the daughter probably rolling her eyes when she was talking to her mother. So, and it was just, I just loved Fern. It's the kind of person I would love to have known. So I really, want to remind everybody that if you haven't read this, please read it. We have copies in the library, and Scuppernong's has your books, I believe.
Scuppernong has copies, and when they run out, they can order them very easily. And I know that the library has book club sets. I just the First Presbyterian Women's Book Club, and I know they got the books from the library. But to me, the book is all about how this vibrant, quite bossy, but very adventurous little girl could grow up to not engage fully with her adult life, which is part of the problem with her relationship with her children. She doesn't have a bad life, and she acknowledges as much. She has a pretty good marriage. She loved her kids. They grew up, they went away. Now they definitely don't approve of her moving back to Michigan, which seems like a crazy thing for them. They grew up in North Carolina. Why would an old woman want to move up to where they have all that ice? But to me, it's really about what happens to her on this trip that causes her not ever to be able to engage with her life as fully again as she did when she was on that boat.
And that's another very fascinating aspect of the story. Well, okay, well, we've talked about what's coming out, which I'm looking forward to that. And I think, time has gone by so fast. Time always goes by as fast when you're enjoying things. I think let's open this up to questions from our participants.